Thank you everyone for joining us and for watching the Secret Marathon film. Again, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us today. So without further ado, I want to introduce our all-star lineup of panelists. Zara Netter. Zara is a doctoral student in gender, feminist, and women's studies here at York University. Her research focuses on the political history of Afghan women. From 2011 to 2017, Zara worked as a journalist with local and international media, including the New York Times in Kabul, Afghanistan. She's also published in The Guardian, ABC News, Deutsche Welle, and Huffington Post. The next panelist is Dr. Megan Schwanski. Dr. Chawansky is currently an assistant professor of sport management at Otterbein University. She teaches courses on global sports, sports marketing, sports facilities, sports psychology, and sport finance. Previously, Dr. Chawansky served as a lecturer and the assistant director of the Global Center for Sport Diplomacy at the University of Kentucky. She's also worked at the University of Bath in the UK and the University of Brighton, where she taught on the graduate program in sport for development. Finally, we have Dr. Holly Thorpe. She's an award-winning sociologist working in the Te Hutaki Waiora School of Health at the University of Waikato, Otoria, New Zealand. Her research interests include informal and action sports, youth culture, gender, female athlete health, and sport for development and recovery. Dr. Thorpe has published over 100 articles and chapters on these topics and has authored 4 books and 9 edited books. Dr. Thorpe's most recent books include the co-authored Feminist New Materialism, Sport and Fitness, A Lively Entanglement with Julie Bryce and Marianne Clark, published last year. She's driven to do research that has real work and impact. Professor Thorpe works closely with an array of international and national sports organizations, including the IOC, High Performance New Zealand, Sport New Zealand, and Skatistan, which also operates in Afghanistan. She works hard to inform new practices, processes, and policy development through her research. So we have allocated approximately 5 minutes for each panelist, and we've come up with some questions to pose to each one. I'm going to hop over now to Zara. I just wanted to ask you, in terms of your opinion of the film, about the ways that you think Afghan women, culture, and society were portrayed.
Thank you for that question. First, I want to take this time to thank you, all the people who came together here, and I'm so excited to be part of this panel because we don't usually get this chance to have like a say in this kind of panels. So to be honest, I'm often disappointed to see the ways that Western media portray Afghan women. Mm-hmm. We can see in the film, there's not a lot of contextual and historical background to the film. When the film is narrating like, okay, how does girls' parents don't allow them to go outside, they're gonna marry them off, you know, we don't know like why they're doing this, you know, like this is not suggesting, and I think suggesting that their parents don't allow them without giving a background information that why this is happening is, I think, not really fair and a kind of risking to essentialize Afghan culture as a misogynist backward. And I think that's, I would be a little bit of, you know, thinking that is a problematic. One of the things that I want to raise here is like, since 2001 and the building of the war on terror, Afghan women came to be represented as a victim. And I'm not sure if that's the anxiety of Western audience that want to see like Afghan women suffering as a victim and then having the need of some protector, somebody come and just rescue them. And that's, I guess, happening since 2001 when US attacked Afghanistan and brought that narrative of, okay, we're going to rescue Afghan women, we're going to liberate Afghan women. But let me give an alternative view at this time, especially in the context of this film, because fortunately I know Zainab personally, and I was kind of disappointed to see how Zainab was portrayed here. The Zainab that I know is a very brave and an inspiring woman. She has inspired so many women in our country to run And she's an advocate for women's rights. She's a mother, she's a wife, she's a daughter. She's working full-time as a manager for an NGO. And she is such a like energy, like you cannot leave, because in Afghanistan we don't have childcare. When you have a child, going to full-time work is very hard, but she's doing that, and she's dedicating her time to women empowerment in Afghanistan. And then this Zainab, when I think I should clarify this story, that the narrated story in the background is not only Zainab's story. It's, I think the producers combined 2-3 story of Afghan women together to create one narrative. So we should not assume that whatever we are here is what happened to Zainab. It did not. In actuality, Zainab's parent really supported her in her wish to run. And at times that they said, you know, you cannot go out practice and you have to stay in like indoor or like in the courtyard because of the safety and security. We don't have that safety and security to go and run outside, not even men. So like we cannot say only like women don't have that security. This is the issue. So the parents wants to protect their children with the means they have. So not all of us are privileged to have different means that we can allow people to take part in activities. So, and beside that, Zainab not having a professional training, not having a facility, and not being able to go run around the city, she somehow managed to complete 250 kilometers of ultra marathon in Gobi Desert in China in 2015. And that is like huge, you know, not having professional training, not having a lots of freedom. You go and run 250 kilometers in 7 days. That is making history. And Zainab and one of her friends did that. And when they come home in 2016, I think Zainab was awarded as a Woman of the Year by French and the German embassy in Afghanistan. And this recognition came with sum of money. I think it was 2,000 euro, which she donated that money to Free to Run to facilitate more like women taking part in sport. So for me, it's a kind of disappointing to not see that fact out there in the movie. Perhaps I might think that this is also the part of that we're gonna see Afghan women as victims, not as someone who are like contributing back, who are very brave, who are working and making a difference despite all the difficulties, despite all the problems they have. And I'm not sure, but it might be due to this stereotype that there is out there in the Western media that sees Afghan women as a victim. So Zainab in no way resembled that stereotype. I think the movie focusing on her, like in the limitation, in the problem that she has, is in a way trying to work with that stereotype, to forcing that Zainab be kind of in that stereotype. So I think that should be rectified, that Zainab is not that stereotype of Afghan woman we used to hear in Western media. And yes, it is true to know that Afghan women have a lots of problem in our country. We are facing a lots of problem, but it is false to think that those problem is because of our father, because of our brother, or because of like our husband or our family in general. You know, this country has been in war, like it's over 4 decades that we have a war in Afghanistan. And that is the result of global politics, not some Afghans fighting within each other. But this is the consequence of global politics that did this to Afghan people. So not having that information in the film, not clarifying it, basically risking to introduce Afghan people, Afghan culture as a misogynist. And I am not happy with that portray of Afghan culture and Afghan. I think my time is going up, but I'm just gonna mention one point, that is Zainab and Kobra's story are happening in Afghanistan under occupation of US. So it's not under Taliban, it's not under Mujahideen or any like fundamentalist group you might think that they're happening. It's just happening while the US is there. So it should be mentioned that the government that the US built in Afghanistan is a government of warlord, government of like misogynist forces that are openly against women's equality. And US is funding them since like 1980s. So kind of, we have to have this broader picture of what is going on when we are like providing a narrative of Afghan women.
Thank you, Zara, for providing that essential context, kind of the onus on these women to be agents of change. And then that actually leads me to a question that I wanted to pose to Megan, Dr. Schwanski, wondering your thoughts on how gender inequalities might be transformed and by an approach that doesn't simply place this responsibility on women and girls to be agents of change. And I know you've done some research on this, but what in your opinion would that look like, to not place the onus on these women?
Yeah, I think I'll respond by kind of picking up on some of Stephanie's points about the mixed gender programming that is part of their offerings now with respect to what it does do. So I do think to start, we do need to think very expansively about programming and who's tasked with kind of quote unquote solving or helping to resolve some of the inequalities we see girls and women facing. And I think that mixed gender programming are involving men and women and other genders to work together collaboratively is the way forward. Now that's said in kind of a theoretical, hopeful way. I know sometimes on the ground that looks a little bit more difficult. But I was actually, I think in terms of the film, Martin gets kind of the man of the year, if you will, kind of vibe, right? He's running alongside, he's sacrificing maybe his own PR, or if he was, I don't think he was hoping for that, but his own kind of performance to run alongside a woman. And, but I was actually struck by the other men, the Afghan men who were, supporting the women in the race in their own different ways, whether it was providing security, providing some of the race logistics, right? So I think there's my quick answer to this is there's lots of ways to be supportive and work collaboratively to advocate for women and their rights in sports and their opportunities in sports, to try to use these sporting opportunities to challenge inequalities, larger inequalities. I think we need to think expansively about them. I think also that we're in this constant kind of reflection point on these questions of what it means to be an ally, what it means to move beyond performative allyship. That's something I feel like I'm grappling with as someone in the US, looking at our current issues around Black Lives Matter and racism and policing, even in my own community in Ohio. So, I mean, these are questions that, yes, kind of speak back to the larger themes of the film, but I think we're all hopefully grappling with some of these questions about what does it mean to work in partnership, to collaborate. I don't have any kind of easy answers beyond that, but I think there is hope to say if we're committed to a common vision, hopefully we can work out some of those challenges on the ground. If we're committed to reflection, we can work out some of those challenges of being an ally, working in partnership, working collaboratively, and working through some of the power dynamics that can sometimes really complicate work on the ground.
Thanks, Dr. Chawansky. And I think first of all, there's so many different discussions going on here, and I wish that we didn't have to rush through such a crucial topic. But I think one thing we seem to also keep returning back to this idea of mixed gender programming and kind of what the structures of various programs might look like. And I know you and Dr. Thorpe have done some research on Skatistan in Afghanistan. And I know Stephanie and Zara are also familiar with this NGO. And so I might pose it over to Dr. Thorpe as well, just based on your work together that you've done with Skatistan in Afghanistan. what might be some possible approaches to women's and girls' quote unquote empowerment. We can unpack that term, even though, you know, the pathways to empowerment might be quite contradictory and complex. How can we essentially focus on, I guess, improving with problematizing the word and term improving their lives through sport, gender, and development work, and what are the problems associated with coming into these programs, focusing on improvement and quote unquote empowerment.
Thanks, Lyndsay, and thanks to Yuka for inviting me onto this panel. It's a real honour to be part of this discussion, and particularly following such incredible panelists. And I'm quite keen to take up some of Zara's really critical points around that that broader context. And so I think my invitation here today is based on that work with Skateistan, who I've been doing research with for almost 10 years now, and I am on the International Advisory Board for Skateistan. And so through this research, I've done interviews with 15 international staff and volunteers who've worked in Afghanistan and the different Skateistan programs, and 10 interviews with local staff as well. So some of my comments and reflections are going to be based on that research. In my research with the international women who had worked in Afghanistan for a long time, a lot of them had come to really deep sort of critical reflections about being a Western woman working in Afghanistan, rethinking some of their own assumptions about empowerment and development. They recognised that they were bringing quite Western ideas of empowerment which didn't work in the Afghan context. And they talked about learning so much through their relationships with the Afghan women and students, and coming to understand some of those gendered complexities, but also the intersection of culture and religion and poverty and global power structures in the situation in Afghanistan. In 2016, Skateistan transitioned to being fully managed by local staff, and 50% of those staff are women. And this transition was basically recognising the very real risks that were posed to the program and to the staff, including the local staff and students, with international presence. And another key thing that came through the research, particularly through the interviews with local staff, was the risks of media content, including Afghan girls and women. And this surprised me. It shouldn't probably have surprised me, but I'd initially been, like many others in the global north, quite captivated by these very powerful images of Afghan girls on skateboards and smiling. And this was really in radical contrast to these kind of dominant hegemonic portrayals of women in Afghanistan, which are obviously very problematic and not apolitical in those images themselves. But engaging with the literature and critical feminist humanitarian communication studies, I came to ask new questions about these media products. And if it's okay, I'm actually going to read a little bit, the first paragraph from a chapter with Lyndsay and Megan that's still in an early draft form for a book that we're working on titled Gender, Sport and Development. And so this chapter is titled The Ethics of Visibilities, Sport for Development Media Portrayals of Girls and Women. So an array of SDP programs focused on girls and young women are utilising social media platforms, digital technologies and film to garner international attention and raise funds for their initiatives. In the context of the girl effect in development, we are increasingly seeing girls from the global south in action, playing soccer, climbing walls, riding skateboards, running and engaging in an array of other sports. While such visual representations suggest a positive move away from what some have termed poverty porn that tends to victimise those from the global south, we argue for a need for more nuanced critical understandings of the power relations and ethics involved in the representation of girls and women from the global south. Located at the intersection of post-feminist, neoliberal and post-humanitarian discourses, many such representations are culturally complex, inspiring and or intriguing to audiences in the global north, and are thus highly effective in garnering the attention of potential donors. In many cases, however, such images are essentially presenting sporting girls in the global south as the exotic other, for the consumption of audiences from the global north. As Sensoy and Marshall suggest, if we view such initiatives and representations as a political text, mirrored in its social context and tied to historically bound colonial discourses and material power relations, then we can ask a different set of questions around whom do such organisations represent and how far the right to represent extends. According to Sensoy and Marshall, media portrayals of girls in such programs demand a closer examination of who represents whom, for what purposes, and with what results. So now turning back to the secret marathon, I was pleased to see the film at least begin with an acknowledgement of the very real risks to Afghan women being visible in such media portrayals. And this mirrored some of our findings in this research. But as the film continued, I found myself becoming more and more concerned about some of the very Western assumptions underpinning the narrative. For me, and it sounds like for other panelists, this really was the story of Kate and Martin, much less than the story of Afghan women. And I do worry about some of the risks and consequences for some of the Afghan women who are featured in this film, specifically in their, or particularly in their interactions with white men. So in this way, it might be argued that the Afghan women in this film are solely understood in relation to and in contrast with their already empowered northern counterparts, which we see exemplified in Kate. But such framings can be dangerous. They can inadvertently reinforce binaries between empowered girls and women in the global north and those needing their help in the global south. Such media narratives are at risk of explicitly racializing, depoliticizing, ahistoricizing, and naturalizing global structural inequalities and legitimizing neoliberal interventions, all in the name of girls' empowerment. So rather than challenging the racialized and gendered power relations in development, such media narratives produced from the global north and for the global north can actually work to shift attention away from the material structures of power and gendered ideologies. As Kaplana Wilson writes in her article, Towards a Radical Reappropriation, Gender Development and Neoliberal Feminism, she says agency, like empowerment, is projected as a gift to be granted by the consumer of the images and potential donor, implicitly reaffirming the civilizing mission. Thus, the notion of victims to be saved, which these images supposedly challenge, is not in fact eradicated, but reworked. Like their colonial predecessor, today's images work to silence or obscure multiple forms of resistance to contemporary imperialism. So this film does not centralize Afghan women's own locally and culturally specific strategies for change through education, community activism, through their own politics, their art, and their family relationships. And this is really frames these Afghan women largely as victims to be saved or helped by white Western runners and filmmakers. So obviously we know Afghanistan is a very dynamic environment and it's changing very quickly. But when we, those of us in the global north, when we're consuming such media products like the secret marathon, we really do need to ask ourselves some critical questions. What are the dominant, hegemonic, intended readings of such imagery? Produced by whom and for what purpose? What are the power relations inherent in such imagery? What oppositional readings might be possible if we locate such imagery in the power relations between the global north and global south and historical and political workings of an international development? And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Holly. You, I think, encapsulated many of the concerns, questions, and ideas that were raised by the other panelists. So appreciate you also grounding some of what you said in some contemporary literature on this very topic. I do just want to turn to the audience now. I know we're running a little short on time, and see if anyone has questions, comments for the panelists.
Lyndsay, if I may, at this point, we just have a question around clarification. Irina would like to know why is it that Zainab did not, that she was allowed to participate in 2015, but not in 2016?
I think I can respond to that because I talked to Zainab just yesterday. The film raised some question for me as well, so I needed to just clarify something with her. And I asked her like why she did not participate in 2016. And what she told me was that first, she had not the training, she had not the space to train for the marathon. And also at the time, her work was too much and she could not make that time to travel. And she did not have the budget to travel through like airfare. And the like traveling through road is a kind of dangerous, especially for us like a woman traveling alone. So that was all the circumstances that she was not able to participate in the 2016 Marathon of Afghanistan.
Yes, I do see a hand up from Dr. Ida Hosa.
Well, yes, thank you. I learned a lot from the film, and I learned also a great deal from the criticisms as well. And I suppose it is a matter of agreement in some ways, but it does raise the difficulty of how even if we try to neutralize for a moment the notion of empowerment, right? And I might use a different notion coming from development as well, but putting that aside, if you were to learn from this film about how to do it differently, about how to, in a sense, valorize her running, there's an old language of solidarity, there's a language of allyship, how might you do it? So in other words, if you had a supplementary way of thinking about projecting less so many of the people with her, and I think it is important. I think someone raised the issue of the different ways in which you provide a kind of infrastructure of people who are there, who are supportive, but how do you make them less visible and allow the narrative of her doing what she's done to be the primary identification of sport through development or development through sport? Let me put it in those terms.
Thank you for that question. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists would like to respond.
Sure, I just think we need to even take a step back and ask those who are producing films like this from the global north, why? What are the assumptions, or what are the intentions, and what's the real motivations for producing these films? If Afghan women are choosing not to tell their stories in particular ways, or choosing to tell them in their own ways in their own local communities or among women in Afghanistan, maybe it's up to them to tell their stories in ways that they feel safe to do so. I think there are many risks involved in telling these stories, and I'm not sure producers from the global north who might see a very powerful story that will captivate audience in the global north are necessarily thinking about those complexities and those possible unintended consequences for those women in Afghanistan. So I think even we need to take steps further back, rather than those from the global north producing narratives. I just think it's even more complicated than that.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said in terms of, the opinions and perspectives of those that chose to shoot this film, the producers, how the film was funded. Zara, sorry, I'm going to let you jump in, and then I have to cut us off. Please go ahead.
I'm just going to take a little bit short. Thank you, Holly, for this very critical point that you raised. I totally agree with you. And just one point that I want to add is that what would this film be if we have very intimate view of Zainab's life? Where did she train? How did she came out to be this powerful woman when not having a lots of facility, a lots of support or freedom, how she did it. It is interesting to know if the film would give us a perspective or a more intimate, we know Martin from his wife, his doctor, and then Kate from partner. But what about Zainab, or what about Kubra? Where are their family? I'm sure their family is not the sort of family that don't support them. If that was the case, they were not there at the first place. They were not being able to reach that stage that they did. So that's our some question that I'm gonna put out there. So just think about what kind of movie we would have if we were paying attention to those perspectives.
You know what, I think next time we should absolutely plan a longer panel. This is, I feel like the discussion is just getting going, and there's so many essential components and dimensions to this film and the ways that we're kind of breaking down and teasing apart the messages that are woven into the film and the broader context, I think, of sport for development and sport gender and development in specific contexts. So I urge everyone to continue the conversation. We can do so on Twitter. The hashtag for this event is Waikato Secret Marathon. And I really encourage you to all find one another on Twitter. The panelists are all on Twitter. And again, just really continue this conversation, and perhaps we can do so in another similar event like this. So I just want to thank the York Center for Asian Research, Alicia Filipowicz and Alex Felipe for organizing this, the School of Kinesiology and Health Science, of course, Dr. Nakamura for co-hosting this with me, the film distributors from Demand Film for sharing access to everyone, and the directors, Kate McKenzie and Scott Townsend, and of course, our wonderful panelists, Dr. Megan Schwanski, Dr. Holly Thorpe, and of course, Zara Netter. So thank you everyone for participating, and looking forward to seeing you hopefully at future events.